Marius isn't here yet, but he's later.
Sorry. Yeah, well, you can hold it.
Yeah, no. So what's the order? You guys are going for the agenda?
Yeah.
Here's. I can show it on the big screen.
Yeah. So Mike goes first, and then you, and then Marius.
Okay.
And with one caveat that we will not cut you off if it goes over time. Don't want to waste time, but it's more
Well, I was
important.
debating the pros and cons. The reason I came is I was debating the pros and cons. The pros and cons of starting with use cases. We were talking yesterday about introducing people to the basic vocabulary. The other possibility is to just do it last. And if people get into the meat on the other two presentations, I'm okay with it. Doesn't matter. Me as the other. But I also realize there's a lot of people who want to use the discussion. So
I think it's more important to get everybody on the same page. Otherwise, if we're talking about it and people don't have the context, then you're not really going to get any feedback on it. So everybody seems to have context. The token one, everyone has a pretty good idea of that. The distribution one seems to be the one where we have more confusion, that we need to drive some clarity, which then I think can help that spec up.
Yeah. Phil's point is that we need to get clarity like 2 levels. One is the scenarios, usage scenarios, and one is the underlying technical solutions or proposed solutions, alternatives.
Are you leaving, Tony?
All right, 2 minutes late. We can start.
Where's your colleague? Yeah, maybe. Why don't you go find him? We're waiting for him.
Or we will move into Phil's. We'll move Phil ahead if Mike's not here.
Sure.
What can we do?
Yeah.
All right. So good morning, everyone. This is security events. We will start with a note 12. Please give it a quick read. It applies to all the meetings in this, all the sessions in this meeting, and in particular to Secevent. Next slide. And this is in priority order. We want to move forward with the SEC token draft, the set token draft, which is at the moment our only working group document. So we will start, assuming author comes in, we will start with issues around the working group document. Then we will talk about use cases for set tokens to drive the third part of the meeting, discussion of the distribution draft. Even if, so discussion of the distribution draft is optional if time allows. We want to have everybody on the same page regarding the use cases of set tokens. So we will put as much time as needed into that. Let me just remind you that we do have a draft on set token distribution, set event distribution, but it is not a working group draft yet. It is not adopted yet. Next, please. So this is the agenda following our goals. We will start with Mike discussing issues on the set token draft. Then Mike will give a short security update around Jose and Jot, which are underlying our format. Then Phil on use cases, and lastly, Marius on the set distribution draft. Next is Mike, please. Yoav will be taking minutes. Rich is Jabber's scribe, and we do have 2 sheets.
Good morning, all, in the middle of IETF week. I'm Mike Jones from Microsoft, and I'm one of the editors on the set draft. And I had volunteered to talk about some of the issues that are being discussed on the mailing list and among people in person. And I hope that we, with the chair's help, can get closure on appropriate actions for some of these. Next slide, please. So one slide of review. We're on the second working group draft. I believe that the semantics of the document are stable and have been unchanged for a number of months. Recent edits led by Phil have clarified the exposition of a number of the points in the draft. Many recent review comments have already been addressed in that process. Some issues are still being discussed, and the next slides will be one per issue on things that I, Phil, Marius, and others had culled from the list that seem to still be active discussions or worthy of calling out. Next slide, please. The first one is pretty simple, that the editors made a terminology change from the 00 to the 01 draft, changing from using the terms publisher and subscriber to event transmitter and event receiver. This was based on some discussions by use cases in another venue, but particularly given that happened based on discussions in a different working group, I thought I would at least pause and tell people that this occurred before we move on.
Hi, sorry, Phil, just to clarify, I did put those out on the list and there was a bit of discussion. I didn't hear any sort of negative stuff, but good to ask the question again here.
Right. I didn't either. I just thought I would call it out as a recent change.
Hey, this is Justin Richer, and definitely better than publisher and subscriber, but I would suggest that in order to get away from the sort of transmission language even further, we could even just say issuer or creator or something like that. Naming things is hard. We could bike shed this all morning, so obviously table this now. But I think it's heading in the right direction.
So I hear you say you'd prefer issuer and receiver?
Yeah, something like that. Transmitter sounds like it has to be transmitted instead of, I have use cases where it is just stored. It is not actually sent anywhere.
Fair enough. And in fact, there is a required issuer in the event representation.
Just as a comment, it is possible, but it does get tricky because there are cases where the transmitter might not actually be the issuer. That's actually the same problem we ran into with ID tokens, where we conflated, we have to use issuer and subject to uniquely identify a person. We end up with the similar problems in the event space when we assume issuer and transmitter are always the same.
I guess I would want to read the draft with that distinction in mind. I think most of the places where we're using the terminology, we are really talking about the issuer, and if the issuer happens to hand it to somebody else that transmits it, that's, I don't think we make any normative statements about that, but you and I could take this offline. Thank you for the input, Justin.
Yeah.
Chairs, anything else or next?
Let's move on.
Okay. All right. I had raised an issue on the list some days ago because there was a normative statement that sets are not commands, which my math brain said, actually, it's impossible to enforce that because there's an equivalent transformation of any command into a statement of fact. Therefore, after some back and forth, and Phil talked about use cases, which I agreed with, I proposed some different wording, which Phil and Justin at least had said seemed to be going in the right direction, where we talked about it's not intended to be a command versus a more normative sounding statement, it is not a command, which makes me happier. I don't know if most of the people in the room care, but I'm trying to not throw any red flags to readers, and that threw a red flag to me. Adam?
Yeah, this is Adam from Google. Just to clarify on that one of the distinctions that came up in that thread was when you are talking about making it a command, then that sort of presumes error codes and things like that based on what the command would have. So are we falling on the other side of the line where we would not expect error codes and, okay, so I just wanted to be clear.
Yeah,
about
I
that.
explicitly, when Phil called that out, said, no, that's not where I'm going. I just don't want language which is inherently contradictory in the spec.
I just want to clarify, is this question coming after the recent language clarification? Because if so, then the clarification is not clarifying enough.
I raised the question early or late last week, and that's because I was rereading parts of it, and I thought, this bugs me. So yes, there's more wording clarification to do.
Yeah, I would want to, I'd need to take a look again at the draft and see in context whether or not it would. So this is all sort of on top of the discussion of the list and not looking specifically at the redrafted language.
Right. I'm sure the editors will look at this and take some stuff to the list.
So to clarify, so I'm trying to understand the clarification. You're saying that we can't enforce that it's not a command, and so you don't want it to be normative to say it's not a command, but you want to indicate that it isn't a command, and so that the intention is that they're not commands, there's not an error code.
That's right. And there is already proposed wording on the list, which I'm not proposing that we review here unless you'd like to bring it up and show it to the room.
Hi, this is Justin. So the contention really comes from the fact that these things may be used as commands in sort of higher level protocols, but this is really a message format and a message carrier. The fact that it could be taken as a command by the recipient is outside of this draft, really. So I could send you a command that says, log the current user out. But as far as we care with this draft, we're just saying this is how you say that message. We're not saying how you respond to it or how you say, no, I can't. I've never heard of that user. They're not even logged in or anything like that. So all of that could be built on top of set, but it's not really part of it. And that's where the tension really comes in, because these things could be commands, but you need a lot more to mix into the recipe in order to make it into an actual command, and we don't want to present it as that.
What I'm hearing is we still don't have clarity on this point, so let's have people respond.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a matter of cause and effect, and people tend to bring across what they know from other protocols. If you've worked on REST, you're used to the way REST happens, and a lot of the comments I get are about to try and repeat something done somewhere else as a command. So for example, logout. One of the distinctions I'm trying to make, and why I was trying to word it a little bit strongly in the document, even though it has no normative effect per se, is to alert people that when you do, for example, a logout event, what's actually being done in the context of an event is to say a user was logged out. The issuer has logged the user out. The effect might be to cause the receiver to decide to log the user out. But it's not a command telling the receiver, it's up to the receiver to decide what command to be invoked. So the nature of events is that receiver decides the command, not the issuer. And so
The receiver decides the action, not the issue.
correct.
Yeah.
So the effect might be the same, but what's happening for the issuer is that the issuer is simply saying, I've canceled user X's session as of this date. There are some things of discussion that might even get more complex that might say, I canceled this user's session a week ago or something like that. Those are interesting cases as well. So this is where I also introduced the notion that events tend to be in the past tense. It might be a nanosecond ago, or it might be we have cases where it's a week ago, a month ago. Suspicious activity, we believe, started a month ago. It's always up to the receiver to decide. We're sharing, so we're making, so I'm starting to use the word signal. These are signals rather than commands, if you want to phrase it that way. I'm happy to keep changing the text, but what I want to make sure is that new adopters don't try to copy a set of commands and throw them in. It seems like a slippery slope because it takes us into complexity with error signaling and other things, and I want to just keep these as statements.
Agreed.
So Leif Johansson, so one way to accomplish this, since this is a specification for other specifications, right? You're actually trying to tell what the profile should do, right? So that's my understanding, right? This is you're supposed to profile this for your application, right? So try to turn what he said into normative language for profiles, saying, profile should not, be written in such a way that they treat things like this turn it into an RPC, right? And figure out a way to turn that into normative language. And then you sort of neatly constrain other profiles, which is what you want to do, I think.
Fair point.
And this is possibly a question to Justin. To me, since we're building infrastructure, there is major difference between building an infrastructure that will accommodate commands versus an infrastructure that's only good for events. And for commands, you simply need more stuff or other stuff to be able, for the receiver to be able to respond to a specific command and say, for example, that it's unable to log someone out. So that's what I wanted to get clarified.
And I think
Yes,
there's
and-
agreement we're not going there.
Right. So exactly. And so what the point that I was trying to make is that I can use your events infrastructure to build my commands infrastructure if I add a bunch of stuff to it. Right. So, I mean, to bastardize a metaphor that I use when describing how OAuth is not an authentication protocol, all right, you need to add more things to the recipe. So what we're building here is chocolate. It's one ingredient. You can use it on its own, and it's great. If you want to build a command infrastructure, that's like making a chocolate cake. You need to add other stuff to it to make a cake. All right. Just because you can make a chocolate cake out of chocolate doesn't mean that chocolate is a chocolate cake. So what we're building here is chocolate.
Okay.
So I'm very concerned.
The example highlights the problems because since OAuth wasn't intended as an authentication language, that when people tried using it for authentication, they had all kinds of problems with it. I think that would be something we'd want to avoid with Secevents, is that people try to go and use it for something that it didn't have the right properties for, and potentially they may be able to build stuff on top of it, but maybe not. And maybe if they want to use commands, they should use something underlying that works for commands.
Yeah. I want to say I take Leif's point and agree. I would actually like to see some normative language. I'm a bit concerned. I know what Justin's trying to do, and I worry about it. And I actually do want to put notice out there that's saying maybe you shouldn't. And that's why I have had a normative no in the current draft.
Anyway, I think the room understands this. I did propose language that Phil and Justin responded to, where it talks about the intent is. And maybe we'll start from there, but the editors will work this.
Sorry. I think we would like to have a consensus call on this point. It's important enough, even though it's merely terminology. But let's do that after the discussion of use cases.
Thank you. Next. This is another terminology question. There was a proposal made as part of that other terminology discussion that, by the way, some places in the draft it talks about facts, and a lot of other places it talks about claims, where claims is sort of the standard JOT terminology that's used most places in the spec. And I think William Dennis of Google had expressed support for using the word claims rather than facts, where it's claims from the point of view of the issuer is claiming that this is the case. The recipient still then needs to make a trust decision about, the veracity of the issuer and decide what to do with that information, just like the receiver has to always decide what to do. Phil?
Just to clarify, and I'll correct it if I'm wrong, the use of the word claims is always used when we talk about essentially the normative sections and we're talking about attributes because we're building on JOTs. The facts word comes in the introduction that's describing what a set is and what it's trying to do. My thinking is that these are facts that an issuer is making. These are not identity assertions and things like that that may be in dispute. If we go down the road of saying that the third party that just gave me a statement, I'm going to challenge it. What does it mean to say that these facts are in dispute? I think the whole point of a signal is a signal is a signal, and you have to take it on face value from the issuer. Again, what I'm trying to steer the reader towards is that these are things that have occurred, a state change has occurred, an action has occurred that may be of interest to the receiver, and that's it.
Leif Johansson again. I actually think that's a rat hole. I think this leads to metaphysics. And let's just sort of, doesn't matter. The term claim is fairly well ingrained in the community. Let's just use it.
This is Justin. I think that claims is, I agree with the rat hole part but for a different thing. I think that claims does mean something more specific than the way facts is used in the draft. I do like the term signal better, or event, or something like that, because facts as it's currently used in the draft is about it's about the event itself. It's not about the attributes, and it's non-syntactical. So I'm fine with
I agree that
fact.
there's two uses of that.
Right. I'm fine with excising fact, though.
And I will point out that where facts is used in the draft, it's often qualified by facts from the point of view of the issuer, which makes me think, oh, the issuer is claiming this to be true. Anyway.
I also, one of the problems with using the word claims is that they are associated with subjects or users. And some of these claims, it's also the terminology that we use for attributes in the JSON structure. I was grasping for a way to say we're not talking about user assertions always. We're talking about a session that was canceled. That's a fact. If I say that I'm claiming the session was canceled, then it calls it into question. So the way we differentiate it is to say that the event is making a factual statement in its entirety. The components of that event are claims. And that's the distinction I'm trying to draw. Maybe it's not the best, maybe we can do a different word, but it was finding that claim is also bound to users, and that causes conflict as well.
Well, claims are bound to subjects. a user is one example of a subject. Jim?
Jim Fenton. I'll basically second what Justin said. In reading, I'm kind of new to this specification, and reading through it, I find the word claims to be an overloaded term. And, we talk about particular fields in the JOT being claims. And then if the whole thing is a claim, then we've got better language than that. I would say either signals or statements or something like that.
Well, let's move on and take it on the list.
Next. All right, now we'll get to some meatier ones. Probably the most discussed topic about the draft has been, is there a possibility of confusing a security event token with a JSON web token? And it's a question that actually does matter a lot, because if it's possible for an attacker to take a security event token and replay it as a JSON or as an ID token in an OpenID Connect sense where that's defined, then there's attacks that are possible. So we do owe it to ourselves to investigate that question. One of the threads on which it was discussed is listed above. I'll point out that once we started really digging down into that, they actually have different claims. An ID token will have a nonce claim. A set will have an events claim, and they generally don't have each other. And we currently have a statement in the draft that, well, you shouldn't include a nonce claim, or you must not. But in the context of a particular event, logout, there's recently been discussion, in part led by Torsten Lauterstadt, who now looks shocked. Hi, Torsten. Where he said, well, you don't actually have to prohibit the use of nonce, in part because there's not a way to inject a different token into the places that an ID token can go. And it's also the case that, assuming that the issuer is not malevolent, which we have to assume, or a lot of bets are off, the issuer will not put the same nonce value into a set that it's putting into an ID token, because the point of the nonce is to have different values in different contexts. So to the extent that an issuer does put a nonce in an ID token, or an issuer for some reason might put a nonce in a set, unless the issuer is intentionally trying to confuse you and enable attacks, there's no need to prohibit nonce. So I think, and there's more analysis we can go into about the use of ID tokens in OpenID Connect, but I at least have reached the conclusion there's not actually a problem to solve here.
This is Justin. I just searched through the current draft and we don't mention nonce anymore. When did that happen?
And I may be confused because I'm also an editor
For the
of the
logout
back
specs.
channel
Yeah,
logout draft, which uses a set.
Right.
And that's the context in which Torsten.
Right. Yeah, I remember that discussion on the other list. So
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, it looks like we don't mention it. We shouldn't mention it. So we're doing the right thing,
We're
even
in
though
a
we
good
didn't realize
place.
it.
Thank you.
It sounds like there is a security consideration we might want to add, which would be to say if nonce is present, it should be a different one from any access token use by the same issue.
I have a second slide on access tokens, and that comes up there.
So is there a consideration I should include?
I think we probably do write some security considerations about how to think about this, and I'd be glad to review that with you.
So
Who are you?
I'm Yaron as an individual. I think we have misunderstanding or maybe disagreement about the threat model. To me, I would not say that the issuer is not malicious. The issuer is a very large system composed of many systems, many hosts and many people. And I'm not at ease with the issuer, some part of the issuer signing a statement or a claim that can be misunderstood as some other claim. So I am actually worried about the issuer in that sense being malicious. And if this is the case with respect to ID tokens, I think this is something we need to deal with, and it is actually an actual problem.
Justin,
this
go
is
ahead,
Justin.
then I'll
Yeah.
say some more.
Yeah, in response to that, whoever has the private key can write whatever statements that they want, fundamentally. So if I have the private key of the issuer,
That's not the point.
that is the point, because that's the only person who can make signed statements from a given issuer is whoever has that issuer's key. And then I can create whatever I want.
My question is, once the set is signed, can it be used or abused as something else while it's going through the pipes of the issuer and perhaps the recipient, whatever it is? So that's my question. I'm assuming the malicious party doesn't have access to the private key, but does have access to the signed statement.
Let me respond to that and then Marius. So in the particular uses that ID tokens are used for, which is as part of an authentication interaction in OpenID Connect, because of the nonce and the fact that either there won't be a valid nonce in the set, or it will be a different nonce than one used for an authentication interaction, any valid receiver, any relying party, that even if an attacker substitutes a set into a place that an ID token should have gone, it will detect it because the nonce won't match. And I can do this with you offline some more, but there's not an opportunity for an attacker to substitute a set for an ID token and have it be accepted by a relying party. That's why I wrote that there is no actual problem for ID tokens. Now, the next slide will have a discussion about access tokens, and that's probably a much more interesting discussion than this one.
Should we move to the access token slide?
Yeah, go ahead.
Marius?
Okay.
Hi, it's Marius. So I'm not convinced that we don't have a problem for ID tokens, right? We make the assumption that we have...
This is ID tokens,
Yes.
not access tokens.
Yes, ID tokens. So we make the assumption that we have perfect libraries and perfect implementations, which in practice is not true, right? So an attacker might exploit the fact that the client is not verifying a nonce properly, or who knows, right? So I think we need a reasonable a way to have a reasonable way to differentiate them, right? A very strong one. And we discussed other ways. I think we discussed them here, so we can go into details when we talk about access tokens, but I don't think we solved the problem for ID tokens.
I'll point out that even if sets didn't exist, if you have a relying party that's not validating the nonce, it's owned. This is why we have a certification program to test libraries. And if you don't validate the nonce, you're toast. Independent of sets.
Dick Hart as an individual, I +1 on Marius. I think we want to make it really clear that an implementation is going to break that's out there today that's taken ID tokens if they were to be given a set token.
And we can describe that in the security considerations, why that's the case.
And the other thing is we are trying to reason our way through why this scenario, the other scenario might not work. And I think that's we cannot exhaust all the scenarios, right? Like we are in an ambiguous case and we should not be there. Because there's always going to be some other case that we didn't think about right now and that's going to be exploited.
I just want to step in and give, for those that don't know what's going on, one of the problems with reusing JOT was we're starting to repurpose JOT, and JOT does not have a typing mechanism of its own that's already there. So the challenge I was raising as the editor in this issue was, do we need a hard method? And I think we do. If having an events attribute is not enough to distinguish, because part of the JOT language is to say that you're free to ignore data you don't understand. And that's more for versioning reasons. So the problem is that the set comes in, it defines event. Existing ID token systems or access token systems will sort of ignore events because they don't understand events. It's existing code. So we're looking for another mechanism that we can use that is non-conforming with the current use, potentially non-conforming with the current use, that would cause those endpoints to gracefully reject those tokens. If we can do that, that would be the ideal case. I'm not sure we're there yet, but that's why we're having this conversation.
And
Not necessarily gracefully, by the way, because this is a security attack.
Ben Kaduk, if you're looking for something that's non-conforming to current use, you could go trivially outside of JOT, like just put a capital S in front of it or something. I don't know.
Why don't we go to the next slide? Because I think that's a more interesting. Oh, okay. We're on the next slide. Yaron, among others, asked the question, which is a good question. Well, can sets be confused with access tokens? And I think it's incumbent upon us to think about that as well. I'm obliged to say in the first bullet, because the access token format is unspecified by the OAuth spec, in the general case, that's unanswerable. However, to the extent that existing practice in Microsoft's implementation and Google's implementation and possibly, I think, Oracle's implementation, Phil is nodding, are that access tokens are represented as JOTs. There's a real question of, could you replay a set as an access token against one of those systems? Some of the techniques that are possible to use to distinguish a set from a JOT, I think one of the strongest ones, in a way that's already used in the intended way in the spec, is to use a different audience for a recipient of a set than the resource or set of resources that the access token was targeted at. And there's been a number of people propose that on the list, to the extent that, for instance, you would use the address of a set recipient endpoint as the audience versus the URL of a resource or a descriptor for a resource. The audiences are different, and therefore the normal audience logic in a receiver of the token, be it the access token or the set, will differentiate the two and throw away things that are not intended for me, hence preventing the attack. The presence of the events claim, if you're aware of events, can be used to distinguish it. Although Phil is correct, we say you're free to ignore stuff that you don't understand. So that's useful for updated code. It is not useful for old code. And this is hand wavy, but I know that Microsoft's access tokens will have some claims that are not going to be in the set. So there's an OID claim and things like that, which the set probably is not going to have. This is now vendor-specific discussion, but in each particular vendor case, there may be required claims and an access token that could be used to differentiate this as well. I personally think the audience solution is the most general and is not vendor-specific.
Hi, this is Justin. Both of these topics really say that, in this whole ecosystem of different flavors of JOT, if you're going to be accepting JOTs on the wire from a third party, you need to be careful about what you accept, full stop. Sets do not cause this problem. The lack of a type field in JOT arguably contributes to this problem, but I would argue that it doesn't even necessarily cause that, because people would be reusing weird type claims and stuff like that anyway, because people are dumb. And I like Mike's suggestion of discussing techniques for doing some differentiation, but calling out in the security considerations that you need to differentiate. If you have different signed assertions in this format coming in the wire, then you need to be able to tell them apart in order for your application to be secure. ID tokens, to go back, and you don't need to go back in the slide, you need to be robust against ID token injection in your OpenID Connect client application anyway.
Yeah, period.
I mean, there's a lot of other issues that come up if you're just accepting random ID tokens and saying, oh, this must be the current user over a random URL. And a lot of those attacks are very well documented. And sets don't cause that problem. But I think that it might be bringing to light the wide reach of that problem. So I think we should discuss in the draft that if you're taking in JOT formatted things in general, then, and maybe this could turn into a JOT BCP or something, I don't know. But if you're taking in JOT formatted things, make sure that it's the right thing, right?
Check the audience.
That is one technique, looking for weird claims in the middle of it that might indicate that it's something else, not ignoring fields that you don't understand. That's another technique.
Torsten?
Torsten, yes, Europe. Just as an observation, I think the problem, there is this problem, that's for sure. So as soon as you use JOTs in whatever use case, you have to somehow distinguish them. Whether it is a set or an ID token, access token, doesn't matter. And I think there needs to be a concept how to do that. We run across that problem in the Moderna working group as well, when we designed the user account migration or user porting. And the solution we picked was to use the type header field in the JOT to indicate this is supposed to be a porting token and not an ID token. So, but I think a best current practice would be a good idea, yeah, because this problem will pop up over and over again. As an observation, I think this problem will become relevant as soon as the same issuer issues set events and access tokens, right? So there is no need to solve a problem regarding backward compatibility as long as the issuer that issues access tokens today does not issue sets. As soon as you start to issue sets which have the same structure, then you have to solve the problem, not upfront.
Actually, I would assert that because in some of our systems, the same issuer issues ID tokens and access tokens,
So you already have this problem.
then the problem may
Okay.
already exist if you're not dealing with it.
That's right. So as soon as you issue two different kinds of JOTs, yeah.
I'm going to repeat something Torsten said because people may not be aware of this. Despite what's been said in some of the discussions, there is a type field defined for JOTs. Its use is not mandatory. You can use it. So it's not like we would have to define a new type field if we wanted to use one. And he said that Moderna is using it in one of the use cases.
Two comments. First, I want to echo, I like Torsten's idea of using a different issuer for sets, even though it might be the same entity that issues tokens and sets. Let me finish. I I think it's a stronger mechanism than audience. I've seen too much code in the wild that ignores audience and ignores nonce. And I call that a soft differentiator. And a different issuer does cause problems, but maybe in a good way, because the transmitter and the receiver have to have agreement on who the audience is and who the issuer is. And it may be reasonable. We also have cases where the publisher or the transmitter of the event and the issuer are not necessarily the same, depending on how the event goes through the big system infrastructure. So that's another piece of the puzzle that could go on the list, is that if you can differentiate issuers, that might actually be the best one of them all, just from my reaction to it.
Marius?
Yeah, it's fine. So in most cases, ID tokens, access tokens, sets refer to users, right? And the user identifier is scoped by the issuer. And because of that, it has to be the same issuer. There's no way around it, right? So you cannot use a different issuer. The only way you can use a different issuer if you use a different issuer at the top level and don't specify a subject at the top level and then push an issuer subject pair down at the event level. That would work. But then we have to omit subject at the top level. So that's an acceptable solution. Audience, I think, is the best short-term solution. And one of the the original proposal was to use a URL or some way to identify an endpoint. I think that has huge problems, because now you tie the representation of the token with the way of the delivery. So that's very problematic. Another proposal was to, in most cases, it's a client ID, but to have a prefix like a URN, which says what's the usage of this set. So there is a URN which makes it very clear that this is a set, and then as a prefix and the suffix can be a client ID or whatever it normally would be there. But again, these are short-term solutions. I think we need a long-term solution, and that cannot be solved in this working group. And we need to find a way to escalate it and have a long-term solution in JOTS. We have a real problem here.
Descartes, as an individual, we need to make sure that any set is going to break existing access token deployments. And existing access token deployments aren't going to be changing their code as they read the set document. So, sure, we could draft something in recommendations here, but that isn't going to fix existing deployments and what they're consuming. So we need to make sure that our set token will bust those implementations if they receive them. And as I look at this, it seems like there needs to be a BCP for JOTS going forward, so people get a good practice and we don't end up in a spot like this.
This is Justin. If that becomes a requirement for this group, then we can't use JOT.
I think there's a practical ground in between, which is, noticing at first that it's unsolvable in the most general case, but that it would be fine for us if people are willing to participate in a survey of how do you represent your access tokens if they're JOTs, and we could get some facts on the ground from some of the working group participants, including, possibly Microsoft, Google, Oracle, maybe even Ping, and solve this in a practical way, even though and describe that solution in security considerations, even though it's theoretically possible that people could use a completely different JOT representation that we would fail to break.
Let me represent the little man on the street. We're not going to solve it by serving a couple of large vendors. We need to solve for the small libraries that people are using for small products to generate JOTs with little understanding of the possible conflicts with other people who are doing the same stuff.
Brian?
Brian Campbell, Ping Identity. We're sort of a medium-sized vendor, and we have product that's deployed in different contexts, and none of these considerations are really anything that we can do directly because we don't know how our stuff will be implemented. So these aren't really applicable to us. And I think in some way that it's a marginal representation of the smaller vendor that you're talking about. I think there'll be similar problems there. I did want to say that I think it is solvable in the general case under the presumption that JOT and Jose libraries are compliant to those standards, the RFC 75, 15 to 19 set through something I suggested on the list a while back, which is use of the Jose critical header. I recognize that there's a decent likelihood that some libraries don't support it because it's sort of an esoteric feature, but it is a must. And under the assumption that libraries do support that, you can embed something in the Jose header that would indicate it's a set, and any compliant library parsing that would reject it unless it's specifically designed to consume a set. So,
do we have any data point at all to indicate that the critical claim is widely implemented?
I have no specific data points. I have my own library that does it, but that's, yeah.
Just a question, maybe you can answer. It's Phil again. There was a question raised on the list about this, that the header is not signed. Does that mean an attacker could remove that criticality?
The header's signed.
It's signed. That's someone confusing. Yeah, that was an ill-informed question. It can be unsigned if the rest of the message is unsigned. But it's an orthogonal question. The header is covered under the integrity if anything else in the system in the JOT is integrity protected. So it's a theoretically applicable general solution. It has some potential deployment downsides for people that haven't implemented the spec to spec, which I sort of agree with Marius. We want to accommodate that to some extent, but we can only go so far. And one idea, anyway. Thanks.
Next.
Yeah, I believe we've covered the ground. Next. All right, now there's a series of about 4 slides talking about uses of different claims by sets that people have discussed on the list and in person. One is how we use the audience claim. The thrust of that discussion is some people had proposed restrictions on the audience syntax, for instance, requiring that audience values be URIs. There were other proposals, such as the one that Marius mentioned at the microphone a few minutes ago, of requiring the audience be a structured field with multiple parts. Others have stated on the list that it should be up to profiles to define what values make sense. For instance, an audience in some cases might be an OAuth client ID, which is up to the authorization server to define the format of. And the point had been made that if we start placing restrictions on the audience value, we're probably going to limit the applicability of sets, because people will just do something else if they can't use a natural audience representation for their system. I saw Tony Nadalin nodding in the background.
Yeah, Tony Nadlin. Yeah, we have, our implementation happens not to use the audience claim at all. So we'd be hard pressed to find a value for the audience restriction here. So we'd like to see it just, let the profiles define what the values make sense and so forth. So we're not for the first part of this thing.
Okay, thank you.
It's Brian again. Something along the lines of Marius' suggestion where there's some defined usage of audience, some prefix or other structure around it, I don't think is limited in the way that that this suggests. The JOT level says the audience interpretation is up to the application, and this would be one application that could define a structure or some kind of format around audience that I don't see how it would be limiting.
It's limiting in that you would, for instance, be prohibiting using a client ID as the audience value.
Directly, yes, but if you had some sort of set URN prefix, you just prefix it and put the client ID on the back. So it doesn't actually prohibit use of anything. It just requires you to conform to the application specific definition of audience use.
There's a meta point which you're raising, which I think is good to call out, which is set the application, or is the profiling spec the application? And at least I am personally taking the viewpoint that for the most part, we want the profiling application to be defining the meaning of each of the fields and whether to use it, and not overly constrain what the profiling applications can do.
There are layers in their applications. I don't think that, and even within a defined structure here, you could allow for that kind of profiling by the application of set, by just having some set. We're trying to solve this problem at the set layer. You can solve it at this layer and still allow for applications to use the audience or some subcomponent of the audience in a way that's application specific.
Hi, this is Justin to stack onto what Brian was saying and answer a very good question that Mike just raised, is what is the application here? I've made the point on the list that in my view, any of the top level claims inside the JOT payload should be defined by set. Set is the security event, is the application that defines those claims. And the profiles get to say what goes inside the events thing, and can also say and sort of an additional interpretation of the top level claims, but they don't really get to strictly say what goes in those or the high level semantics of what they mean. So there's probably a slide in here on what issuer means, I'm guessing. I haven't looked at your slide.
I think that's 3 slides from now.
Okay, so once we get to the issuer slide, I might get up here and say again that the top level issuer really should be the issuer of the set. And if there is another issuer involved related to the event, then that absolutely should go in to the payload. There was a thread, Ben and I went back and forth on this on the list of whether or not you could even do both and have, the issuer in both places at all times to have a common syntax. So maybe we'll get back to that, but this is all
we will.
This is all part of this higher level discussion though about what do these top level claims mean, who gets to decide what they are. So I'm kind of with Brian on this one in that we could define a syntax, and I don't think it would actually hurt any of the downstream applications. I really don't. That said, I personally don't like the idea of defining a syntax just because I don't see what value it brings. That said, I could be convinced if there is a solid utility. Marius and Brian have made an interesting point with this prefixing and this other stuff. But so that's where I'm coming at from this. This really should be defined. Set is the application here.
Mike, we're running out of time, so can you pick one last slide and then move on?
Oh, okay. Let's go to previous. Issuer probably covers the rest of this. That there have been discussions, as Justin was repeating at the microphone just now, about what claims should go at the top level, what claims should go as event parameters, and whether we mandate one thing or the other, or whether we leave it up to the profiling applications. And there'd even been a proposal, well, why not require the issuer to be in two places? And others have said if they're going to be the same for each use of the event, then it would just be duplication of information, and that's not a good practice. So I think this will continue. This discussion will continue. I'm just wearing my individual's hat for a minute. I will say that if we put syntax restrictions on audience, that's in conflict with the use that OpenID Connect backchannel logout makes of it, in that it says the client ID is the audience. As the profiling application, it says the audience will be the client ID. So it's not that we can't break that, but people should be aware that there's already a profiling application that expects to be able to set the audience as it sees fit.
It's Phil. A downside that I'm worried about, while having a duplication seems wasteful, I think the problem for people parsing the sets is now they have to actually check for the absence of an issuer in the event payload to make sure that the subject is bound to the issuer of the set. So you're proving that something isn't there before you come to a conclusion. So you're still having to look for a value that's there or not there, and that gets confusing. If we were to actually say all sets have the issuer and subject embedded in the event, then I only have to code it one way. It's I'm just thinking about how it's coded. So
This is Justin. I also was thinking about this in terms of code paths.
In terms of what?
Code paths.
Okay.
So in addition to the semantic clarity of what any particular claim means at all times, I would prefer, as a developer, to be able to take that event object and get all of the information about the event that I need that's specific to that event inside there. Everything above that I would consider as the envelope that carries that event to me, right? So if I have an event that is a logout, I have event, OpenID logout, issuer, subject, audience, client, blah, 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 all of that other stuff. That is about that particular event. I can put my client ID in there because that's what I'm expecting to see inside there, right? Because that's where I'm looking for that logout information. Up at the higher level, I don't know that I'm parsing a logout event yet. So effectively, I have to go look at this event, then, oh, okay, now I'm got to go look up into the higher structure to see, what all is going on and stuff like that. So I think it definitely, I don't know, I'm on the fence about where we ought to go with this. My gut tells me that events should be self-contained, and everything in the upper portion should be separate, and information redundancy is no big deal here. These things don't really have to be small, right? What are we optimizing for?
I'm going to make a meta point and then sit down. Maybe we'll do the next slide, but the meta point is this. You're making the discussion from the point of view of a particular use case. Yeah, and the use case that you're describing is one in which there's a general purpose event parser and a general purpose event dispatcher. That is a valid set of use cases. And Phil's going to get to use cases in a minute, but another use case is one in which only one type of event is allowed, and there's a special purpose parser that pulls the fields out of that kind of event, and anything else is rejected. That's just as valid a use case. And so all the considerations about general purpose parsing don't actually come into play. And
I would counter that to say, I think you're looking in a narrower space. Where
I am.
You're always looking at it from the perspective that the identity provider issues all events. My perspective as editor is I'm seeing that as maybe a third to a half of the total family of events, because relying parties are also issuing events. And so right off the bat, the general case is there. And then I would have said it was half and half, except that we also brought up the possibility that one of the differentiators might be a separate that you have a set issuer and you have an identity token issuer that may have different things. And then that means that if your OP uses a separate issuer to issue sets, then it has to also use this abstraction to say, I'm talking about the identity provider's subject who is different from me as the issuer. So just to point that out.
Right. And I think we do want understanding of different use cases to inform the discussion is the meta point. Next.
Well, the next one is,
The main question I wanted to raise is, given we're supposed to be going to working group last call in June, I would ask, whether that's possible or not, we can't decide yet, but I would ask for people to be diligent about discussing these issues and trying to drive each of them to closure in a timely fashion.
so it seems like there's still a lot of different opinions on how to address the security concern. It seems like we need to enumerate what are the different options more and look at the pros and cons of each one and then be able to hopefully come up with a solution to this. And I think we need to have that before we can go to last call, obviously.
Obviously, thank you.
Did you go ahead?
Yeah, Jim Fenton again. Popping up to a much higher level of abstraction on the document. I think there's some fairly large structural things that need to be fixed before it's ready for working group last call. A large section of the document, I think it's section 3, is labeled security considerations. That's not a security considerations section. There's an RFC that describes how to do that. It gives a bunch of normative requirements. Really, the security considerations section should be talking about the threat model, how it responds to the threat model, all of those sorts of things. So you need a real security considerations section and then rename that. Also privacy considerations, some of the things about audit and all that really don't seem to have to do with privacy. So there are some higher level things that need to be addressed.
Thank you, Jim.
Just to throw an idea out, I suspect that we might end up with a separate privacy considerations document. It's probably bigger than the current document, wider in scope.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and one of the reasons those sections aren't fleshed out yet, I should have actually put TBD in them, is that the situation is we're writing a spec that other specs will profile, and what I want to gather is what are the common security considerations and to inform both implementers and spec writers that we need to put in. The privacy one, I think I want to do, but this is where one of the reasons I'm participating in as many of the downstream spec groups I can is to try and get what are their privacy considerations and are there common patterns that should be part of the core spec. So anybody who wants to talk to me about that, that's on my to-do list and I want to pound away on those. I'm open to flexible timeline on all this stuff, so I can, if we want to shove it through and meet the timeline, I'm okay. If we think it's another 2 cycles, that's fine by me too.
So if the people, current authors, or even better, new people who want to work on privacy considerations, please let us know.
Oh, I got the wrong thing up.
Yeah, it's still Mike.
It's still Mike.
Yeah, Mike. Yeah, Jose, Jot Security.
Okay, that's not the slide yet.
Yeah, I know.
Thank you, Mike.
Hi, I'm Mike Jones from Microsoft, and I had been invited by Yaron to give a brief update on security discussions that are happening around Jose and Jot, given our use of those specifications. As most of you know, these were finished over, or just about 2 years ago now. And they've been in widespread use for a while before they were actually finished. Recently, there have been a few blog posts made alleging security problems or describing actual security problems, I should say, and I wanted to talk about the two that have garnered the most attention. Next. So Antonio is a frequent contributor to the OAuth world and a security expert at Adobe. He described a vulnerability in some JOT implementations in which you can mount an invalid curve attack against Diffie-Hellman key agreement, the ECDH-ES algorithm. And the gist of it is that because there's an elliptic curve point as an input in the decryption calculation, it turns out that if the decryptor fails to validate the elliptic curve point, the attacker can construct an invalid point in a way that reveals information about the private key. And then they can keep doing this, rinse and repeat, and eventually determine the private key. And this has been shown in practice. This is something that it's unclear from an engineering point of view where that should be solved. It is certain that you don't have a secure implementation unless it is solved. I know, talking with some colleagues from Ping and whatnot, they'd told me that some of the Java libraries didn't have this check. Some of them have added this check. I know that Brian Campbell implemented defense in depth in his JOT library, where he's doing the point validation. Then even if the Java library that he's calling into does point validation, all is good. This is something that's applicable actually to any use of Diffie-Hellman key agreement with this algorithm format. Because this is enabled in JWE, implementers need to be aware of this. And so Antonio did a service to the community by pointing this out. Next. I do not know Scott. He wrote an also provocatively titled post that Jose is a bad standard that everyone should avoid. And what he's describing is there's a requirement in JWS and JWE that the user of the format validate that the algorithm or algorithms used are ones that meet the security requirements of the application. In the limit, there's a lot of places where using alg none doesn't meet the security requirements. And so the application has to verify that that's not being used if it's not okay. But in the same way, and this was widely discussed in the working groups at the time, you have to verify that you're not using an algorithm that's known to be compromised or deprecated. And so crypto agility means that there always will be this moving target, and applications are going to have to be aware of the crypto that they're using, or they will end up being insecure. This is a little bit flippant, but you can't just silently sprinkle crypto pixie dust and expect that your apps to be safe. The apps have to be aware what algorithms they're using. But Scott does point out that there have been implementations that fail to do that. And so in that way, he's also providing a service, even if writing in possibly an overly negative tone. Next. You know how to use that Macintosh thing, Dick? I actually know what I'm going to say. So one of the things that we could be doing, including here, if people want to do that, is working on writing down what are some of the best practices that implementers need to follow in order to have secure implementations. A lot of this is not JOT or Jose specific, it's general crypto hygiene. But if we can collect a bunch of things that people do wrong and describe them, and maybe post an article on OAuth.net or what have you, which is a resource available to us, certainly wouldn't hurt.
I just wanted to, sorry, Leif Johansson again. I wanted to make one more observation then, sort of that something we could maybe have a little bit of sort of self-criticism about as a community when we apply let's make things simpler arguments, right? Then there are some people who are going to we're actually not going to understand the fact that security rarely is part of the simplification. You're not going to build, even if you change the data format of your tokens, right, from XML to JSON, right? That makes it simpler in some way, right? But the security bits of that will always be complicated. And some people will just sort of say, okay, I'm going to make it simpler and turn off security. And that's, I think, some of the implementation problems you have is that people actually like things simple all the way through, right? They want to turn off stuff because it makes life just sort of extremely simple for them, right? And so, you know, maybe there's some lesson to be learned here, right? That when we are on this, when the IETF or the development community or whatever, right, is on this simplification trip, some people are going to sort of take that as an incentive to turn off stuff they shouldn't turn off, including security and including security awareness when it comes to implementation. And maybe we should learn some lessons from that.
Brian Campbell again. I want to wax philosophical a little bit, like Leif did there. Algorithm agility is necessary. We all need it, but I do think that some of the ways that we've chosen to enable algorithm agility, particularly in message level security constructs, has made it easier for some of these attacks and criticisms to take place. We're not going to redo JOT right now, but just something to be aware of. We do want algorithm agility, but it doesn't necessarily have to be through an explicit value in the message itself. And the way that was chosen to be done does expand the possibility for the kind of mistakes to happen that have led to a lot of this criticism. So maybe there's an opportunity to do something different or a little bit better in the future. That said, what we have is what we have, and some guidance or notes about how to use what's in place securely and what the application needs to be done would be welcome. Despite all the criticism, I'm a big fan of the technology. I use it a lot, and I thought Scott's write-up was, it had a few legitimate criticisms, and then it was a bit hyperbolic, to say the least, and kind of self-serving, in my own personal opinion. But I also think this relates back to the previous discussion about Secevents being misused because they're JOTs. I would really love to avoid a whole nother round of Monday morning quarterbacks talking about how awful JOT is and how terrible it is and never use it again because of something that comes up in a misuse of a Secevent against another application protocol and attack. I don't want to relitigate all the different options. We obviously don't have a solution at this point that we agree on, but I don't want the Secevents work to introduce the new possibility of JOTs being bad all over again. So I hope we can come to some kind of workable solution there.
Kathleen Moriarty, AD, and I was AD for Jose as well. So if you're going to publish a best practices, getting something up quick at OAuth.net makes sense. I would appreciate that there's ample review on it and contribution so that, you know, we have a nice solid response. We need to publish a draft on this. This is getting widely used. That's something that, you know, I'd likely AD sponsor without a problem. If we decide we need to change something, you know, we can bring that up and discuss and figure out what do we need to do that. It might be a quick working group to change that. And I say that because it's getting used in lots of places, and I'm seeing it pop up around the IETF too and other drafts, and I'm quite surprised at how quickly it's getting adopted and how much it's getting used. So I think being proactive on this is going to be very important, and acting quickly but cohesively to make sure that we have good messages going out. Another option we have had, and I think we'll have with the next chair, but I'll have to confirm, is that I could also do something in coordination with, you know, a few of you as co-authors and post to the IETF chair blog. So that at least then it might have more reach to the general IETF who are pulling these in. So those are just some additional options.
Thank you, Kathleen. And thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Now we're doing use cases, right?
Yeah, now we're doing use cases.
Okay.
So Dick, if you could keep your finger on the button, I'm going to try and go through this fast because I think I want to leave as much time for Marius to go through. Maybe not that fast. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide. Okay. In the diagrams, you're going to see some stuff. The blue curvy arrows are typically flows of information through user agents. Black arrows are indicating an HTTP request. You can assume there's a response back. And that just indicates something that goes on normally in a back channel through a typical API that you would expect. The dotted lines are events. I've chosen dotted because often they happen asynchronously, although it's over HTTP. It's asynchronous relative to maybe what the user's doing or a back channel request. It's not an immediate response to a request, it's a separate channel. So there's a bunch of cases we see. We use a term called explicit federation, where an identity provider is linked to a relying party because users are getting authentication assertions going across. And I include in this SAML, OIDC, and even OAuth 2 exhibits a lot of those traits, although they're not really an identity provider. It's an access token provider. The point here is that the identity provider often wants to share account state change information, session control information, and things like that. An important observation that people miss is that relying parties also notice security things. Relying parties have their own session constructs, their own session life cycles. There are times when the relying party wants to say, I've logged the user out, and that's important because the IDP needs to know it in order to log the user back in. Another important one is the relying party is probably the party most likely to notice suspicious activity, and you'll notice that a lot of commercial websites are starting to offer these services. I know Office 365 just announced it. We have a package. So there's things where you're looking at the behavior of users. You're also, the relying party is in the position to see when things are going bad with access tokens, authorization headers in general. You start to notice that, oh gee, it looks like that token was copied because it's coming at me from multiple places and not from one agent. So you want a way to be able to signal that activity back to the IDP so that the IDP might think, should the account be shut down? So in all of these cases, you want to consider that there are overlapping events and there are different events that each endpoint wants to signal to the other. The most simplest thing we've got is logout. So if we go to the next slide. And in OpenID, there's an endpoint where you can cancel a session or log a user out, and then an event goes back out to not just one relying party, it might go out to multiple relying parties. So that's there. That's what OIDC logout's doing. SAML has a similar flow, though it's not expressed as an event. But we might expect similar things cropping up there. Go to the next slide. So a couple perspectives to also keep in mind is that an identity provider is providing services to multiple sites. You have a notion that when I issue a logout at the identity provider, in order to effect single sign out, I'm actually issuing events to multiple places, not one. And if I reverse the perspective to the website, go to the next slide. Websites now have, particularly consumer sites, now have multiple IDPs. So the enterprise case is more the previous slide where we typically have one designated IDP for all employees. When we're talking consumers, keep in mind that web applications are actually dealing with session controls now from multiple entities. So this is why getting a common standard is important here. Next slide. There's another concept that might seem strange at first called implicit federation, and this is really the, what was the fellow from Wired magazine was pointing out that because he used a common email address as his sign-on account with all these different websites, that causes linkages from his email provider to the web application where he's signing on with his email address. It also turns out that there are attacks when you use the same telephone number, and we as humans tend to use the same identity information in every website. So we're discovering that there are implicit attacks because of the relationship the users naturally set up. So one of the communities, which is the risk community, is looking at the idea of how can email providers and relying parties share signaling to help prevent identity theft. Next slide. One of the questions in my mind, if you look at major email providers, they often do hosted domains as well. So question on my mind is how would we set that relationship up? When you think about enterprise email, those systems are not likely to be able to process security events. So we might see the need for a security broker to process those events. And I don't know, send emails to an operations center to say, Phil Hunt's account looks to be compromised, that kind of thing. So that's in the back of my mind as one of the scenarios. Go ahead and next slide. Provisioning is another area, and this is actually the area where the events work started about 4 years ago, and we've sort of been gradually expanding scope. But the original goal was in the cloud world, we have data not just managed within the enterprise. Now we have value-added data being managed in different locations. So you have the enterprise, you have Microsoft Azure, you have Oracle Cloud and Oracle apps. And there are lots of competitors building more. What we're seeing is a network of apps, but the enterprise perspective is, how do I keep control of this and make sure that people can do the stuff that they need to do, and people can't do the stuff that they shouldn't be doing, and do those life cycles. So what we found after we did skim, and it was very successful, we found out there is backward signaling needed to say a state change occurred over at Salesforce, and that needs to be reconciled back so that we can coordinate with Oracle and the other vendors. So there's a bunch of cases. It turns out a lot of the cases for events actually are about 80% overlapped with risk. So that's another observation. When an account state changes, that's also often a provisioning state change. So interesting observation there. Next slide. This is
Apologize, a question about the previous one. So what are the assumptions about reliability of the channel for provisioning events?
We're assuming it would have to be assured delivery. That was something I didn't mention in the other slides that's in some debate. For example, logout. I'm trying to reconcile that back channel logout is there because front channel isn't reliable, yet the current back channel spec doesn't call for reliability. In the case of provisioning, we do want some reliability because our goal is governance and to make sure that things are working the way they are working, the way we think they're working. So yeah, we do have a requirement for reliable delivery.
Is there a requirement for reliable in the other use cases? All of the other use cases?
I would tend to argue yes. As far as the draft goes, the way it's been written, its reliability is up to the receiver. It does make a minor obligation on the sender. And we can go into that some other time, but that was sort of my goal to say, if you really need massive reliability, it's there if you want it. And there's one obligation that the sender has to meet to make that happen, which is pretty minor.
Tony Nedlin, in this particular case, we don't mind if reliability is there. We're doing polls, and so we don't really care about the reliability aspects, but there's nothing wrong with it actually being there.
Yeah, that's a, do the next slide. This is actually the enterprise reality case. I drew a red circle to indicate that enterprises have firewalls and they don't like mounting web services. So the problem is, if you're trying to send a signal back from, as a cloud provider, back to the cloud, it's hard to do an HTTP post. It's not in the current draft, but it's on my list, and Marius is going to talk to this a bit more. Let's skip these 2 slides. That was simply a point that if we have a common standard, great, but the web actually is a messy place, and manageability is a concern. So how do we keep that under control? Next slide. I was sort of talking to some people yesterday and so, what are the basic requirements here? We've been talking about, we need a method of transferring and delivering events. There are too many different uses that are 95% the same. It would be a shame that we end up with 10 different ways to deliver. We've seen other communities working in other standards body working on this. They ended up with dozens of different connector methods and an unimplementable spec. So I don't want to get there. We also need a way to configure the streams. What are the endpoints so we know how to do it? So there's the method of transfer. Is it HTTP post? Is it HTTP GET in a polling architecture? What's the method? How do I configure that and manage it? I need a way to detect or prevent missing sets. So some of that's covered in the method of transmission. Another of it might be just a simple check that the receiver can call back and say to the transmitter, is everything working from your end? Have you been unable to deliver events? There is other possibilities that people have raised saying, I want to get an event numbering system so I can detect by looking at the event numbers if I'm missing an event. We're less thrilled with that because numbering events and ordering events is a very hard problem on a distributed system. So the proposal we have kind of addresses this requirement, which is simply through the control plane to say, is the event delivery still okay from the transmitter's perspective? Go to the next slide. Another possible requirement, and this is where it starts to get debatable as to how much we need in a mandatory spec, is can receivers update the configuration to redefine the signing keys if it's an encrypted event transmission, redefine the access token the transmitters to use, things like that. How much configurability should the receiver have? Because the debate is quite rightly, maybe the receiver administrator should go to the transmitter's website to manage that, or should it be an automated interface? That's a question in my mind. Managing content, there's been a fair amount of discussion. I can't remember how much of it ended up on the identity event list, but to bring it back here, some receivers want to control both the event types they receive and the subjects about which events are being issued for. So there are some questions about consent. Does the receiver control consent about what data gets sent to the receiver, or does the transmitter? So those sub-working groups have to, profiling working groups have to work through those problems. But in the core spec, I'm asking the question, okay, does that have to at least be possible? It is in the current spec, but that's why I mention it, is there are some groups with this requirement. If you look in the earlier drafts, I actually defined about 5 different ways to define a feed and the contents of a feed and how to manage that. I sort of pulled that out because it's kind of not germane to the issue of publishing events and distributing events. It's more of a higher level management concept.
Phil, which use case had that requirement?
Risk.
Really? Really?
Well, it was actually your case, Dick.
No, it wasn't.
You wanted the ability, to put it in the terminology you were using, you wanted to be able to control which subjects are in the feed or not in the feed.
Yeah, that's different than which events I received.
There's 2 dimensions to it, right? And I said the first part was which event types, second part is which subjects go in them. So the risk event types, this is the various working groups and the types of events they're talking about. A lot of these events, by the way, aren't that complex. They're more, the biggest piece of information is the event type, and you define a meaning for that event type, and you often have a subject. There's not a lot of payload data that we're talking about here. We're not talking about transferring a lot of data. It's more the fact that an account was suspended. Often there's no need to really say why. It's just, it was suspended. That's all you need to know. So you might want to cancel all the sessions. Let's go on to the next slide. Skim, you'll notice there's a lot of events that are quite similar. There's what I call low level, where people kind of want to do replication, which bothers me a bit. That's not the intent of SET, but it's there and people are talking about it. But then there are high level events that say, I do want to notify of the high level. Somebody does a password reset, somebody does an account suspension, it becomes the same thing. The interesting thing is, I think that we don't necessarily need to reconcile it. They'll actually be interesting because of our relationships and the way we've constructed SET. It becomes possible to express simultaneously an account suspension in risk and in Skim. And if there's any differentiating data, they're not going to collide with each other. So if Oracle and Google want to share those kinds of things, they can. Or if Oracle and Microsoft share the Skim event as well as the risk event, that's okay, but Oracle and Google might not because Google's not using Skim. So just to point that out. So these are a bunch of others. There's the OIDC backchannel logout spec. In that case, it's an example where the subject is defined by the use of issuer and sub, which we had a long conversation on. Heart is a consent spec. The reason I put TBD is I guess you haven't gone down the road to think about what are the distribution requirements quite yet. Is it a Dropbox or something like that? Sure, if you want to.
Justin Richards. So HEART, for those that don't know, is an awkward acronym for Health Relationship Trust. It's a working group in OpenID Foundation dealing with healthcare IT type APIs and whatnot. And we were one of the first use cases that fed into this working group along with risk, because we want to be able to use this type of stuff for more of an auditable receipt of something that happened. So a user consented to something. A user said that a particular provider could access their medical record, or a provider accessed their medical record. Sort of those kinds of events are the kinds of things we're after. So in our cases, this proactive notification that is really necessary for Skim and risk and stuff like that, we don't have the same kinds of requirements. And in fact, we don't really know exactly what type of environment that's all going to be falling into. We do, however, have a very real need for being able to describe this is a thing that happened in a way that is sort of loggable and auditable and all of that other stuff.
I think there might be some interesting common privacy considerations when we've talked in the risk group about, has the user consented to the sharing of security information? So while you're doing it for a very different purpose, it actually might be some commonality we can leverage off of here. That was another reason to keep it on there. OAuth 2, we do have RFC 7009 is an endpoint where you can revoke a token. What's missing from my perspective is the downstream notification to the audiences that the token was in fact revoked. So I kind of expect, analogous to the logout spec, you'll see an access token revocation event requirement coming forward. That hasn't started. There's no draft in the OAuth working group for that, but I kind of expect it would happen soon. Thanks.
Question, could you go back to the SCIM events?
Yeah.
Yeah, so if we take away low-level, resource-level events, which you indicated that you don't like, if we take them away, then what remains looks very much like risk events as far as reliable delivery, in-order delivery, and maybe how much latency we are willing to take, like in the minutes or hours or days for these events. Is that correct?
I think that my sense is that risk doesn't have, right now it's perceived as value added. So the requirements for delivery and latency aren't quite as strong as, say, they are for SCIM. That would actually be one of the differentiators, is that SCIM, you want to make sure that governance and access control is maintained in a distributed system, but risk, this is value added information to let different security systems coordinate. But it turns out the events they're talking about are the same. So yeah.
Okay.
So this is in part why the distribution spec becomes important. It needs to be able to accommodate both assured delivery, and for those that don't care that much about it, they don't have to put as much effort into it.
So Tony Nadlin, from the low-level events, we're still interested in the low-level events because of directory synchronization. So you can't, removing them makes directory synchronization useless.
Yeah.
Can you give a couple of examples of low-level events?
Yeah, wind up deleting somebody, wind up modifying somebody's profile in Azure or anything else like that. Those are low-level events that happen, and we sync between our directories right now using the SCIM events.
So is that an event saying it's happened and then there's a query to get the data, or is that
So
intended to
basically
go and move the data?
we wind up polling for these particular sets of changes, and we will act upon those changes.
One of the ways we did some talking, this is where the old SCIM work was there, and we haven't talked recently about it. One of the possibilities is that the most important event is often just that the account has changed. It's a little bit more costly, but what the receiver can then do is go back, make a SCIM get, and then do a reconciliation. There was a bunch of examples I had about problems when, for example, Alice gets CRM entitlement, and if we just replicate commands across the place, it fails miserably because you go across and you say, give Alice CRM entitlement over to Salesforce, and Salesforce says, who's Alice? Fail. You sort of want Salesforce to be able to say, oh, this entity ID such and such got CRM. I need to call back and find out who that entity is so I can first create the account, then I can give them CRM entitlement. So there are problems of unequal state because each party only knows about the users that are active in their domain. They don't necessarily have a copy of the entire enterprise user database. So this is where signaling helps fill the gaps. So the thing Tony and I have to work through is, do we need low-level events, or can we simply use events as triggers that cause a natural reconciliation to happen using SCIM? And that's something I want to start prototyping very soon with Tony's group.
Yeah, to put things on the table, we are worried about this becoming a general purpose synchronization protocol.
So, yeah, let's finish up. So the idea of this slide, and I'm calling this Ven's hairball, is each one of these are a protocol, but it's also really a service instance that you might have in your system, and therefore it might start caring about events. So it came up the other day after I mentioned implicit federation and email identifiers are linked in with applications, and that causes a relationship there. Somebody said, well, what about telephone numbers? Same issue occurs there. Well, we have Moderna, which I didn't mention their requirements. They don't have any thoughts there, but I can see the same implicit federation issue popping up. We've got, I mentioned the 3 federation protocols, OIDC, OAuth2, and SAML are all doing explicit federation. And we have SCIM overlapping quite a lot of them. So what you have is a community of specs that have a lot of overlap with one another. So this is part of the reason we're here, because we saw that overlap and a few years ago and thought maybe we should get together on a common JOT and possibly a common distribution method, so we can do that. If we go to the next slide, this is sort of highlighting again the issue of overlapping events. So one of the great things about standardization is we can reduce the conflicts and possibly reduce redundant overlap and get to more efficient design. So I just wanted to point out that there's a whole family of things going on, and when I hear people say that's not my issue, be careful that you might be talking in the 5% space, or you might be actually not aware that the issue is your issue, you just haven't got there yet. So that's normal. We're at that stage where people are coming up to the same level. But I wanted to call attention to the overlap between all the areas that at least I'm noticing. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you.
I mean, on that note, I worry that we become too broad and too much general purpose and becomes all singing, all dancing. You know, there's so that balance between solving a very narrow case and solving a very broad general purpose case that's too much scope. So as a working group, we need to be clear about what's in scope and what's out of scope. So I don't know how we're going to figure that out.
Yeah. Sorry. So, in fact, I would like to hear more opinions, maybe more diverse opinions about the question of synchronization versus events. Anybody? So specifically low-level SCIM events, low-level object modification events.
Yeah,
That's
I'll comment
not as
that-
diverse as I wanted, but yeah.
Yeah. Just because I'm one of the SCIM people, so I'm putting my SCIM participant hat on. Replication has been a hard thing. I think the distinction in this go around with it is that set itself would not define the replication, but it might be used as the trigger. And that sort of brings it back into fitting along with the others, that if I have a trigger, then good things can happen, the reconciliation process. So part of the problem is knowing that something's occurred that you can react to.
Tony Nadlin, we don't do that now, but it might be something that we could look into for, you know, changing what we do. But, you know, currently, you know, we're just utilizing the events for, you know, synchronization purposes. And I don't think there's anything that seems so natural and it was so easy to do. And it solves a humongous problem as far as our directories are concerned.
Leif Johansson. So this is another topic that's been nagging me. In the event format spec, there is a little bit of language around the definition of a subject that sort of seems to indicate that the subject could be like a web resource or even the IDP itself or something, right? And there are no use cases that I could see that it even comes close to covering that, right? So I think we should probably clarify that, or drop it entirely, right, and make it clear that we're talking about like data subjects and not like systems, or maybe have use cases that cover that.
Yeah, from the Jabber room, Morteza says +1 for Tony and Phil's comments. Our only Jabber comments so far.
Adam Dawes from Google. So I think the synchronization versus sort of event thing kind of goes back to the earlier discussion that we had around how much these are commands. So I think when we get into the realm of synchronization, I do feel like we're starting to get into the realm of commands and higher integrity and transactional integrity. Whereas on the SET side, I think we're trying to get on the other side where these are events that have happened that are likely to have some implication or repercussion on the recipient, but are not strictly to be thought of as transactional things that have happened. So that's sort of where I feel the distinction is between these two things. And so, some of the core problems that we've been trying to solve with risk are, I think, fall well outside of the transactional thing. Like this account was hacked and it might have been in a compromised state. That's a very sort of advisory thing, and there may be a set of prescriptive things that a recipient could do based on that information, but it is not at all like you must do these sets of things. I think as we've looked at publishing events on the risk side, they do start to bleed in, like if an account has been deleted, that does have security implications for the recipient, and it's perhaps a little bit stricter about what you'd want to do, but I don't view those things as in the realm of synchronization.
Joe Salloway, Tableau. Similar to the previous speaker, I think that there'll be some pretty different requirements when we go down the path of saying this is a synchronization mechanism. So I don't know that it's the wrong thing to do, but I think we would want to be real explicit about when the goals were around synchronization to make sure we were meeting, in the additional security requirements and transactional requirements versus the things that might be different when it's more of just an eventing mechanism.
Just to interject on here, it seems like another way of looking at this is, do we need a reliable transport or not, right? Is it a best efforts on it? Are we is set more like UDP and there's maybe another layer that's the TCP, or are we trying to build something that's TCP like where we know there is transmission? There's opinions on that.
I think the problem is that
transaction.
Yeah.
I think it's the perception. The issue is that it's a bit orthogonal in the sense that it's not so much the spec area that cares, it's individual receivers that care. So while Google might not care if it gets all of its events, Oracle does. And that's the balance I'm trying to strike with the current draft, to not impose on the transmitter one way or the other, but the receiver. Basically, the assurance is that if the receiver doesn't care to parse the JOTs that it's getting and doesn't care to check whether the transmitter is having problems getting, then that's all you get. And if you don't put up clustered fault-tolerant systems or whatever, then that's all you get. You get best effort. For the transmitters, the loop back that assures the acknowledgement that a JOT was received is the simple, I think, 2-line requirement in the spec that says the receiver should acknowledge before sending back a status 200 in response to the post. The receiver should validate that everything was correct before doing that. Now, if the receiver just wants to accept blobs and doesn't really care whether they parse and whether they make sense, then it's free to just send a 200 back. It's not a mandatory thing, and that's really where assured, what the transmitter is allowed to assume is that if it gets a 200, the receiver has acknowledged you can let that event go. There's no need to reconcile. There's no need to retain that event, and it's gone. So it's a very minimal imposition, and that was where we tried to strike the balance of a minimal level of assurance that it was delivered and that it was parsed. But if the receiver fails to do the parsing, that's the receiver's problem, and we make that clear in the spec.
Marius Kutos with Google. Another distinction between synchronization and security events, I think, is the amount of data that is present in that event, right? Like for synchronization, let's take the example of password change. You probably want to send a new password so you can synchronize the new system, maybe, or other attributes. Whereas for a security event, you don't need that. All you need to know is that actually the password changed and it has security implications. And in general, like for synchronization, you need a complete set of data there to be able to synchronize.
Oh, well, Tony, my understanding is your use case, you're thinking that this was an event saying that synchronization needed to happen as opposed to you moved the data in the event. And so this is an event saying the password's changed.
Yes, so
and then
that's why we wind up polling, and we will pull the other information that we actually need to do the synchronization. So we're not asked, our current, what we're shipping today does that. We're not looking for the detailed events that happen and synchronizing off the events. We're looking for the trigger that comes and says there's been a potential change in this. Let me go and pull that particular endpoint for the differences that actually happen in between.
Well, I'm not sure. I don't know that I understand.
This is Justin, and to agree with Tony, I think this actually goes back to what the language that Phil brought up at the very beginning of the meeting, and that's to treat these things and maybe even call them out as event signals. And because it really is the, for this replication use case and for a lot of other things, it really is the, hey, here's a signal that I'm sending across. And I think it's absolutely true that in some use cases, your use case, your deployment is going to have reliable transport. In other cases, it's going to be best effort. In other cases, there will be no transport. It will be creation and storage for lookup and use at a later time. And so I think that those two things are absolutely orthogonal with each other. But if we treat them as, like the name says, events, as signals, as this is a thing that happened, as opposed to here's all of the information that I'm trying to convey about what happened. I'm just telling you that something happened.
I'm a little bit confused because there are things that you absolutely cannot do without higher level mechanism, transactional updates, polling for what has changed since this timestamp or this record number. These are things that we would need to specify in the protocol if we wanted to support synchronization.
No, we don't have to do that. That's not our problem. So we get to say, hey, you have an event that you want to say, like, there's a thing that changed. We get to define, this is the envelope, how you carry the information about the event that changed. If somebody wants to take that and build a protocol using that component that says all of this other stuff, they can do that. We can give them the tools to do that.
So Tony Nadlin, we already have this in SCIM. So we can do that. We know we can ask for a difference of what has changed. Once we get the notification, we already have a profile that says, hey, tell me everything that's happened here. And it will send us back what we need. So we don't need any of that particular stuff that you say we need.
But this polling thing is not an event. It's definitely a command.
I just to save time, I want to volunteer that Tony Morteza and I will review this, and we want to make sure that we're conforming with the scope that we're talking about, which is one, to avoid commands and all the other issues
that we're talking about. And if it can't work, we will probably let the group know, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to expand the charter. It might be an issue that we have to resolve later on our own. But I'm pretty confident. I'm pretty confident that what we're looking for, like everybody else, are the signals. And once we have the signals, what we have in SCIM is 90% there. The notion of actually passing a command, in theory, saves a step, but I don't think it's an overall boost to network performance the way SCIM is going to work. So it's the signal we're looking for most of all, and that fits within what this group's talking about.
Right. I just want to stand up and support that. It's not a command. You choose to use that signal in any way you want to, right? You don't have to act on it.
I am confused.
So the chairs are a little confused. So we're viewing that everything is an event and not a command. And so the signal you're looking for synchronization is that there's been a change, but you're not trying to move any data about what has necessarily changed in there, that you're going to use some other out-of-band mechanism to move any of the information. So is there anybody wanting there to be command-like things where you're moving something? Okay, so the scope is that we're moving an event. You're saying something happened, and the other side may or may not do anything based on that. You want a consensus on that?
I think we have the consensus. on
Okay.
that, so let's move on.
So given that, Maris, we can go to the distribution.
Hi, I'm Marius Cortescu with Google. Together with Phil, we are editors of the set distribution draft. And we are going to go over a few of the issues that came up while working on that draft. As it was mentioned, it's not a working group draft yet. We are working towards that. So the distribution draft defines how set events are delivered from a transmitter to a receiver using HTTPS. I used some heavy colors on my slides there. I wanted to specify that the white slides is stuff which is in the current spec, and I'm just bringing the issue up because we had lots of discussions about it. The yellow slides is things that need work, and we know that they need to get into the spec. Red ones is stuff that either was removed or we decided, and we talked about it and explicitly decided not to add to the spec at this point. And green stuff is things that might be nice to add, not sure. So there was quite a bit of discussion about data plane versus control plane. At this point, I think we have pretty much consensus that we're going to have both a data and a control plane. The data plane goes from the transmitter to the receiver and sends the set events. The control plane goes the other way around from the receiver to the transmitter, and it allows the receiver to check the status of the stream, to the configuration of the stream, and to manage the stream. There were discussions because some events can be seen as both as commands for the control plane or events that can be transmitted in a data plane, for example, a user enrollment or a user opt-out. And there were proposals that for simplicity to drop the control plane and just have a bidirectional data plane. I think we decided not to do that. Some of the reasons I outlined there, because there are no clear messages on the, basically data planes are not a good way to send commands.
So also in this one, there's been a change to the receiver and transmitter. There was some comments around the set document on that. Is there any confusion, or do we need to have different terms on this?
Receiver and transmitter actually makes sense when you're talking about transmitting and receiving things, which this draft is. And that's it. So this is precisely why I took issue with the terminology in the other draft, is that it's an orthogonal consideration. So this is good.
Okay. Next step.
Color is this?
Yellow. That means stuff still needs work. So control plane operations. At this point, I think the draft only defines one operation where we can get the state of the current configuration of the stream. And there have been proposals in and out of the draft about using some stream management. One of them is to update the stream. One good example is how to force the stream in a given state. And another one is how to create streams. And when we talk about stream creation, we have run into issues with one or multiple streams between the same transmitter and receiver. Maybe some of the parameters that the receiver can specify as filters and such. And another control plane operation that we keep talking about and keeps coming up is user enrollment. And I think Mike brought up the issue if user enrollment is the right, actually dealing with user level issues is the right level here, or maybe should move to one of the profiles. It's a fair question. So,
can you clarify the second, the bullet about verified state? What do you mean?
Oh, so a stream can be in several states. The verified state means that the transmitter will send, if it's in the verified state, the next thing it's going to do is send a specific verify message to the receiver. It's a standard message defined in the draft. The receiver needs to recognize that this is a verification, like a ping, needs to recognize this one and reply. And
why is that a state?
Why is that a state?
Oh, I don't know. It's currently, well, it allows.
Because you're not going to answer anything else in between.
I'm sorry.
Is it because you're not going to answer anything else in between? Is that it?
That's kind of
Okay, I'll let Phil.
It serves two purposes. One is when you initially set it up, because we're talking about a lot of crypto, it confirms to the transmitter that the receiver was able to parse the message and was able to validate it and produce the response that's required back, which is contained in the set. So if the receiver, it means it avoids problems like, are you sending to a mistakenly configured endpoint that's either or a fake endpoint, and they don't have the keys necessary to decode the message.
But why is it a state?
So that actually is a state, but the ping is a different thing. So
It's the way it's set up. It could be used. It could be used to just say, I want to make sure that the receiver is not freaking out because we haven't sent him any events today. We just send him a verify once an hour, and then the receiver
change the state, or are you just asking for a ping?
Yeah, I guess it's a fair question. I don't think it doesn't have to necessarily be a state, but it's modeled as a state right now. So.
Just one thing that might actually be useful is to go look at the BGP state machine. I think that's more or less trying to do exactly the same thing. It does exactly the same thing, right? It's trying to keep two systems more or less in sync while making it relatively easy to discover or quickly discover when one of them sort of just goes bork.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're sort of trying to do the same thing for security event. You're trying to send a bunch of stuff from point A to point B while discovering when either point A or point B goes away.
Mm-hmm.
As quickly as possible.
So that was BGP?
Yeah, the BGP state machine, right? Just look at that, right, and do that for HTTP.
Okay.
That's what I would do, right? And that sort of goes to what I was actually stood up to say is that I think we should be very careful and keep anything related to the semantics of the events as far away from the transport as possible, right? Don't have any extra concern for user enrollment or anything else, right? Because I actually think this could be a fairly useful mechanism for other stuff as well.
Okay. Another thing which is not solved right now is the control plane authorization. So the control plane is basically a set of one or more REST endpoints, and the caller must be identified and authorized. I think it was mentioned until now that we probably should use OAuth2 and access tokens, in which case the transmitter, it's an IDP, the receiver is an RP, and it has a client ID and secret issued by the IDP. And then the receiver can get access tokens and then use them on a control plane. Again, it's not clear. Maybe this should move to the risk profile and then allow each profile to deal with authorization on their own. It needs to be solved in some ways.
Yeah, I was just going to say this shouldn't be a problem because we can just add security later. That always works. No, really. So
Well, I don't know. We can imagine profiles that are not using OAuth.
Right,
using other
exactly.
protocols. So that's the
yeah, I say this only half jokingly, in all honesty, because I do think that it is a very real consideration for the working group whether we want to have a single security mechanism that's deeply tied to this distribution control API, or whether we want to leave that open in the way that HTTP has. So I think that's a question we need to address.
I think interoperability is a requirement, and you probably need something for interoperability.
And I'm going to repeat myself saying that be very careful not to mix semantics from the data plane into the control plane here, because not everything, and this is something we struggle with in Skim a little bit, right? So, yes, Skim events are about users, and you could sort of think about stuff mixed. We could have gone down the road of adding things like @self or @me, from open social like things, right? But we decided to keep that well away from Skim, because a lot of deployments are really server to server or server to server with air quotes, right? And the authorization mechanisms it's much more sensible in practice to just stay away from OAuth and just client cert TLS often, right? Because that's what you do in a lot of situations, right? So let's be careful here.
yes.
Do we want to get any consensus on that, and whether we want authorization authentication to be in scope or out of scope?
Yeah, that's the room.
Sure. Wondering if people have some views on consensus on whether we have the authentication being in scope or out of scope of this working group.
I'm putting my voice for out. But have security and privacy considerations section being very clear about you actually need to do this, right? But there are so many there's so many ways you could do and deploy security for something like this. It's sort of allow.
So that's an out.
Yeah, that's an out, and let people figure it out.
I think one of the things I'm sensitive to is you want to simplify and
Who's speaking, please?
Phil, again, Phil as editor. One of the things I'm sort of aware of is that if we narrow the scope and say that, let's just say we pick OAuth, that the streams are defined using OAuth tokens and credentials, and we profile it that way, then it's only one way to do. I kind of went through this cycle with Skim as Leif described, and it's a bit tricky, but it does let people do what they want, and it is powerful.
So you're saying it's out of scope? Yes?
I can put it in scope if there's a strong consensus to do so.
So no opinion. Okay.
Tony Nadlin. So as we did in Skim, we didn't consider this, and so I don't think it's within the scope here.
Does anyone think that it should be in scope?
Just to clarify things. So yeah, it kind of makes sense to be out of scope to me, but probably each profile can decide on their own. It should be in their own scope, right?
That means it's out of scope of this one.
Yes.
Okay.
So we never get interoperability on set on its own.
Could I get some feedback on the attributes or the metadata for the stream, since there's going to be more variability that might increase the amount of data options fields are required to manage those streams? That's my only comment there. So if people are thinking, I'm planning to use method X and the data's not there to manage that, please let me know.
So I guess. Anyone, you want to? Yeah, sure do.
Aaron Scheffer as an individual. So I'm worried that if we keep authentication out of scope, we can never even test interoperability on set as its own self-contained protocol. Whether that's doable at all, I don't know, but if we are to do that, we need to have some baseline security mechanism in scope in the protocol.
So that's why I mentioned maybe we should make it mandatory that profiles should have to have it in scope, because any interrupt is going to happen at a profile level anyhow. So I'm skewed towards risk. Like for risk, it only makes sense to be in scope. But I don't know for set. So.
Yeah, but that means that risk will be able to have interoperability, which is good. But nobody will be able to run an interoperability test. Like if I'm writing a generic set library, there will be no way to interoperate because we don't have any normative security mechanism.
I understand, but I don't think interoperability in general without having a specific profile makes sense, right? So it's not going to work like that.
I think I tend to agree with Yaron here in that.
Who's speaking?
This is Joe Salloway from Tableau. If you don't have, I think ideally you would have some library that supports these this transport. And if you don't have some mechanisms inherent in that, then this is all going to be left up to different profiles and I mean, that might be the right answer, but I'd like to understand better, why there wouldn't be some common, infrastructure there that would be useful. But certainly if we don't go down the path of having something in the base spec, you would need to require that in the profiles.
Not really.
So, Tony Nadlin, I don't see why this would be in the base at all. There's so many different ways to do this. You can't, it's impossible to have a universal fit all. If people want to do this, they define a profile for their specific technology that they want to use. Putting it in the base just screws everything up, and you probably won't get interoperability that way. Because we may not support what you guys have, what goes in this profile.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say we don't? Yeah, you could clarify.
So here, I think Joe said something about in practice you would have like a library, a set transport library, right? I think in practice what would happen is that you would have a set transport library for making that relied on like an HTTP stack, right? And the authentication mechanisms of the HTTP stack would be available to you, right? And so it wouldn't be a problem injecting an OAuth bearer token in there if you needed to, or injecting a client cert if that's what your preference is. And in practice, sharing these kinds of events are going to be dependent on establishing some sort of trust between like a group of collaborating entities, right? And those collaborating entities are going to figure out what they need and want to do, right? And that will definitely vary. That's why we layer these things on top of HTTP, because HTTP allows us to make different choices. And so specifying you must use OAuth, right? Or you must use this or that, it just sort of takes away the point of using HTTP.
Kathleen Moriarty, AD. So 2 questions. You're saying mandatory to use. Do you want just one for implement for interop testing? So it has to be.
Let me attempt that. So what would be the mandatory to implement security mechanism for HTTP? I would use that.
Okay.
Is there such a thing?
Well, so if Do you mean with OAuth, use of OAuth?
No,
Just
not at all.
HTTP.
HTTP, exactly,
I
HTTP.
wanted to clarify,
Yep.
and I wanted to clarify that because OAuth bearer tokens have 3 registered appropriate to use techniques for authentication from HTTP auth, and which I don't like any of them. So
I'm not talking about HTTP.
I'd like you guys to fix that, or the OAuth group.
Right. As long as you support something that HTTP supports, right? But I think the question should be, what's the mandatory to implement security mechanism for HTTP? And I want that. You want which? Whatever is the. So whatever is the mandatory security mechanism for HTTP could be the mandatory to implement security mechanism for this. And then you're done. I don't know if there is one, right?
I think it's got to only be either basic or digest, unfortunately, because the new methods that came through from HTTP auth are all experimental.
Which just demonstrate that the HTTP community seems to be figuring this out anyway, right? So we don't.
I don't know that they're figuring it out.
Well, there's a bunch of stuff that's being used in practice, right, for HTTP, right?
Right. I guess maybe we need that feedback into our area is what I'm saying is we don't have anything better right now in standards and following documentation and paths. So we have a problem, which is why I'm at the mic.
So
I think we have a
you just
problem.
say you need to supply a secure transport stream that has these properties and run HTTP over that. So like, I came up here to say that I'm really confused why everyone is worried about the security specifically for testing interoperability. Because in my head, I was just thinking you can supply the secure transport stream. Some of the subsequent discussion has perhaps made it more clear that the concern is that there's going to need to be some integration between the actual HTTP traffic and the authentication. But it's like if people are talking about we want to use, TLS client certificates for authentication, that's not at the HTTP layer.
So just to avoid any confusion, right? We have a data plane and a control plane. We don't have any issues with the data plane. We are talking about the control plane and how to authorize. Maybe that was clear, but how to authorize the control plane. That's the only.
Let me add to that. There's, it's Phil as speaking as editor. There, and adding to the control plane, data plane, there's actually 2 layers to this. There is the HTTP layer. My thought is to follow SCIM model because it's not doing anything special. It's just another HTTP service. Much like Tony has said, this just works like any other HTTP. The thing to keep track of is that you have a receiver asking a transmitter to provision something so that the transmitter can talk to the receiver. That's the one gotcha. Then at the message level, we have security in the JOTs themselves. What are the keys being used to sign? Are there encryption keys to sign for the recipient? So there's 2 layers of security that need to be configured. At the HTTP layer, I think when you're trying to have the receiver tell the transmitter what credentials to use, that's why I have it in the metadata, so that the receiver's objective is to know how to run its transmitter to the receiver. So the bootstrap problem then is, how does the receiver get the credential? And that's just to access the control plane. That's just the normal stuff we do, whether it's any HTTP service. It might be an OAuth flow, it might be a basic auth, whatever. It doesn't, SCIM had to go through the same debate. And in part because the old LDAP world had a bind command, and we pointed out saying, no, SCIM is an HTTP service. There is no authenticate service. And that's worked out. So I don't think that this service is special, that it needs something. The only reason for choosing, say, OAuth is to say there's only one profile for everything. And I don't think we have that agreement. So.
Next.
Where are we on that?
So I understand myself. Do you think the room has consensus on how to move forward?
Not sure there's anybody else that sort of thought we needed to spec something.
Okay,
It didn't
so-
seem like.
Okay, so I'll take back what I said. I understand that we can have interoperability even if we don't specify security, at least at the transport level here. So I'm fine with that.
Okay. Another issue that was discussed quite a bit was using scheme for the control plane. At this point, I think we decided to use it, but there's still a little bit of back and forth. So we don't need to use all of scheme. Streams are defined as scheme resources, and then can have all kind of operations on them. So we get a lot of benefits by using scheme. People thought about it quite a bit. We have libraries. The biggest cons is probably that the set distribution will not be self-sufficient, and it has to point to a very large external RFC. So implementers will have to wrap their head around two different specs. I don't know if anybody else has any pros and cons to discuss here.
I think that the other part that you get is that for the most part, like any REST API, you're going to look at the examples and you've already got 99% of the information to implement. In the last reworking of the draft, I made it so that while the get command to get your stream configuration data is technically looks like a SCIM thing, it's doesn't have to come from a SCIM server. It can be SCIM compatible.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea there was, if all you implement is the mandatory to implement, which is the get and the transmit, you don't need a SCIM library at all. If you want to do management and you want to have a flexible data model for defining the contents of streams and other things, the great thing about SCIM is there are a dozen ways to model that. So a profiling group has a lot of flexibility to say, this is how we want to manage stuff through the control plane, if, and I say if, that's appropriate.
Dick speaking as an individual. I reviewed the last draft that you put out, Phil, and somewhat familiar with SCIM, but it's not clear to me as to how you would use SCIM to manage streams. And maybe if there was some non-normative language or some examples, but it may make sense to you, but to... So in reading the draft now, it's not clear how I would use SCIM to manage.
Are you going to present later?
No, there are examples in the last section that go through create, modify, patch, that kind of thing.
So maybe we want to see them?
You want to switch to it now?
Yeah.
I'm happy to put lots of examples.
You
That's
can
no
go
problem.
to the seconds. Oh, I think you wanted to switch to the draft. Do you want to switch to the draft and look at it right now?
Oh,
Yeah.
to the draft. I thought we had it in the slide.
No, it's not this slide.
Okay.
Okay, so let's just go to the next slide.
Okay.
We talked about supporting a batch mode where to one HTTP post to be able to deliver multiple sets at once. The main complication is that the error response is complicated now, so you cannot rely on the HTTP status code. You need an array of status codes to see which sets were accepted or not. And it was not clear there is a real need for batch mode, so we decided not to add it at all. I'm not even sure if it never was in the draft, I guess, right? But we did talk about it. I'm not sure if anybody has strong opinions about the batch mode and performance here, but
There has been a concern raised about a combinatorial effect where you have the transmitter transmitting a JOT with an authorization that is also an access token. So you've got performance hit with the access token, performance hit parsing the payload, and so it becomes an n-squared effect on performance. I still think that's small compared to other considerations. but the point made to me in batch is that you have one access token to validate for maybe 1,000 payloads that you want to do, and you want to spend your CPU cycles evaluating sets, not evaluating the security of the connection.
Right, but typically on the data plane, I don't think you will need an access token to begin with, so I don't think that's an issue there. There is another point which I forgot to put on the slide, is that from an implementation point of view, it's very unlikely that you will be able to batch up a whole bunch of events and send them, because those are stream of events. You're going to deliver them as they arrive. And also the other point to make, that the decision not to have a batch mode, it's only for the HTTP post delivery method, and each delivery method should look into this and see if batch mode makes sense or not in that case.
Yeah, and yeah, to that, just to emphasize that if you're batching stuff up, you're not passing data in near real time. If you're batching and sending once a minute, then the data is delayed by that factor, and that's an issue for some people anyway. So that's why I kind of came around to saying and agreeing, saying batch has got very little benefit.
Right. Also, at some point, we talked about discovery, both for the transmitter and for the receiver. So for the transmitter, we could have a discovery document, which is based off the issuer URL. And it can have a whole bunch of attributes there that describes the capabilities of the transmitter in general. And this might help receivers to sort of auto-configure during the configuration and setup process. Next. And in a similar way, the receiver could have a discovery endpoint. There's no way to build a well-known for a receiver, because there is no base URL for a receiver. So the receiver will have to document the full URL to a discovery document. And again, that discovery document could provide a whole bunch of attributes which are useful during the configuration phase.
How much more do you have?
Not that more. I don't know, 3 or 4 more.
We're at time now.
Yeah. We talked about universes versus bidirectional streams. I think for practical purposes, we can always talk about unidirectional streams and extend it. We talked about user opt-out. This might be just for the risk profile, where users can explicitly say, no, I don't want you to send security events on my behalf. I understand it's a privacy versus security trade-off. And there are some challenges of how you implement the opt-out, how do you synchronize both parties to stop sending events for that user and whatnot. But again, maybe this should be taken just for the risk profile. So. Distribution methods. So right now the spec talks only about HTTP post. We did talk about other methods. Polling, we talked about that quite a bit. And then there was others mentions like XMPP, Kafka, WebSockets, or all kind of proprietary ones. At some point we had a registration mechanism. We removed that. Maybe we should add that back. So that would be one question. Do we need a registration mechanism for other distribution or delivery methods? And what would people find useful? Would HTTP post cover most use cases? Right now, do people feel the need for some other methods?
This is control plane, right?
No, data plane.
Okay.
So, Phil, the registration is in an optional section of the spec. What it allows a client to do, presuming they have the access credential to access the control plane, they can go and create a stream themselves that indicates the data they want, what their endpoint is, and provide the data that the transmitter needs to send events back to the receiver. So that's just an HTTP post command to the control plane, and that works.
We're out of time here, guys. Yeah.
Okay. Is there? All right.
As we thought.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
The blue sheets. Blue sheets.
Yeah,
blue
blue
sheets.
sheets.
Blue sheets.
Yeah. Well, I know you. Yeah.
Nobody has a blue sheet.
Anybody seeing the blue sheets? Yeah. Yeah.
You want to meet with this young guy or you just?
Yes, I do.
So,